big guy is back there. He's going to swing it.
Shouldn't take their
Cops and Klan go hand in hand! Cops and Klan go hand in hand! Cops and Klan go hand in hand! Cops and Klan go hand in hand!
I'm Raphael, and I'm not a white supremacist. I'm the president of the UBCSFE. The barbarians are at the door, trying to come in and kill us all, but they will not. Whatever they. Anyway. Alright, first of all, let me thank our sponsors, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and the Academic Freedom. Alright, I wrote this wrong. Society of Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Right, rules. No foods, no drinks, unless you got a lid on your cup. What else? No filming, unless we've already authorized you. We're going to be filming right there. Nick, you should go watch the camera. Peter, go watch the camera. All right, no speaking except during question period. And during question period, do go one at a time. Do you have a question?
No. Right.
No statements right now. All right, let's start this then. We have here tonight Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, who is a retired professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick. He has written 3 books, including Uniqueness of Western Civilization and Canada in Decay, all of which are here, by the way, which you can purchase at the end. He was forced into retirement, I believe, April this year, after 100 professors from his university signed a petition to get him out. And right next to him we have Mark Hecht, who was a sessional lecturer at Mount Royal University. He has written the book, The Rules of Invasion and the Fallacy of Conquest. And he's become infamous in the last month for writing an op-ed for the Vancouver Sun called Trust Requires Less Diversity in Canada, criticizing the current rates of immigration in Canada, and got a lot of flack for it, being called a white supremacist. So why are we having this talk? A recent study by Echo's Research found that 69% of the Canadian Conservative Party and 15% of the Canadian Liberal Party think there is too much non-white immigration in Canada. 6 years ago, the same organization found it was 47% for the Conservatives and 34% for the Liberals. So clearly there is a shift going on, and this immigration is becoming more and more of a partisan issue, and yet we only find one side of the debate on the UBC campus. The Students Against Bigotry and other forces at UBC and all Canadian universities have been working to keep any dissenting opinions out of their campuses in order to protect minorities. We have invited them repeatedly to come have peaceful conversation with us, but they have refused. I personally talked to the UBC Students Against Bigotry twice in person and got yelled at the bus. So, and also we invited a panel. We invited 10 professors to have a panel to contest the opinions of both our guests here, and they all rejected. What else? Yeah. I have a question for the Students Against Bigotry and for everyone here and everyone watching this. When you remove Ricardo Duchesne from your university, and when you ban Mark Hecht from your newspapers, where do they go? I'll tell you where they don't go. They don't go homeless. They don't go live in the sewers. And they don't flee the country. They're still here, and their ideas have not gone away. If anything, Ricardo Duchesne has become more prominent for his books and his interviews than for any other work he has ever done at the university. No offense. So I'm just a stupid undergrad student, but in my opinion, if you find someone has ideas that you think are dangerous, deplatforming them is a losing battle. And the only good way to go about it is to debate them in a civil way, which is what we're here for. So we are doing half an hour for Mark Hecht and half an hour for Professor Duchesne. And then we have someone who wrote a letter and he wanted to read it out. I'm not sure if he's here. If you wrote the letter, can you please raise your hand? All right. He did not make it. Okay. And then we'll open the discussion to everyone. And you can ask questions and we're going to give priorities to anyone who disagrees. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Raphael. I have slightly different statistics, but they all sort of say the same thing. I've got 63% of respondents to a recent Leger poll agreed that the government should prioritize limiting immigration. Or in other words, people are concerned about who we are, where we're going, who we are becoming. We want an open, honest debate about immigration. And yet, there's a pernicious dogma that blocks it, that blocks this honest debate. And it's a simple dogma, the dogma of diversity, tolerance, and inclusion. And it's a dogma that quietly slipped into our society, not so quietly now, and it's being forced upon us. Well, tonight we're going to have that debate. But first of all, I want to thank the students for freedom of expression at UBC here, and I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, making it through the gauntlet. These guys really are doing some fantastic work. And so we're going to have a healthy debate. Because when we get to listen to each other and share ideas, hopefully, at the end of the day, we walk away with a new perspective. And we've learned something because we came with a mind of curiosity instead of one of arrogance and self-righteousness. Then we all benefit. We all make the world a better place. So thank you for everyone coming tonight. When I first knew that I was coming here, I thought I would talk solely about what I had written in that op-ed piece in the Vancouver Sun that had gone up for all of about half a day before it came down. But I began to realize that what I wrote was actually pretty easy to explain. What's more important is talking about the three ingredients that make up a social justice warrior, and why logic, rational thought, and open debate will never win over the extreme left. You know what I'm talking about, you've seen them outside. But if we mix a certain number of ingredients together in just the right way in this cauldron of murky ideological slop, eventually out pops a social justice warrior. With all their garb, their chants, their slogans, their Orwellian speeches, and the reckless use of the term racist. Before I get to those three ingredients, I do in fact want to explain what I wrote, or what I was trying to say in that short op-ed piece in the Vancouver Sun. So I was arguing that the dogma of diversity, tolerance, and inclusion is flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. Now when I say a dogma, I'm referring to the definitional word that means a principle or set of principles laid down by an authority that's incontrovertibly true. This dogma has been allowed to fester and balloon, and it essentially says more diversity is better, more tolerance is better, more inclusion is better. But life is never a path of linearity. It bounces instead between this kind of duality, this yin and yang. It's always looking for constant balance, and it's never avoiding the tension that maintains a comfortable balance. So for example, let's start with inclusion. At night, you might close your door, well you probably should close your door, and you lock it. You exclude the world from coming in. In the morning, or during the day, you open up your door to the world. But even then, you still exclude people from your home. So you exclude people from your home. There might be that person who gathers the trash or goes through your garbage bin in the back alley. You know that you will exclude that person, or most of you will. And that does not mean that you hate that person. It just means that we all include and exclude in equal amounts. Inclusion requires exclusion. So, well, let's get to the next one. Tolerance. Tolerance is defined as the capacity to endure continued subjection to something. Well, I've got a bit of news. Too much tolerance means you're being walked all over. Tolerance requires intolerance. Doesn't sound very nice, but it requires it. So if I was blindly tolerant of all the mistakes that my students made, they would all have A's now. At a certain point, we all say, okay, I'm no longer going to tolerate that, whatever that might be. There's absolutely nothing wrong with tolerance, but there's also nothing wrong with intolerance. The two must go together. And diversity. Oh, diversity, okay, where to start with this one? As someone who studies biogeographic patterns and invasive species, I can tell you that nature does not constantly strive for more biodiversity. If you want a simple platitude at the level of a child, then sure, go ahead and say something simple like, nature loves diversity. But if you want a real discussion, a serious discussion, then we have to start by recognizing it's much more complex than that. The truth is that nature does not constantly strive for more biodiversity. And for us humans, we operate in a similar way to the natural world. And the social science data is pretty clear about diversity. Some cultural diversity within a society, and this is maybe where Ricardo and I differ, I'm talking about cultural diversity, not skin color and race. So some cultural diversity within society is known to be quite beneficial. It drives new ideas, perspectives, innovations. However, beyond a certain threshold, increasing diversity causes increasing divisiveness. And increasing divisiveness leads to a breakdown in social trust. And social trust is the basis for a healthy, productive, happy society. So a little bit of diversity is good. Too much is problematic. And social scientists almost universally agree on this. From early studies by Robert Putnam in the 1990s to Alberto Alsina and co-researchers at Harvard University in the early 2000s, to more recently Ruud Koopmans at Humboldt University, and even more recently Aaron Pons at Michigan State University, this last June, Pons concluded that diversity effects are largely negative. So I was arguing that the dogma of diversity, tolerance, and inclusion is fundamentally flawed. Now, there are many that try to defend the dogma, even some of my own colleagues at Mount Royal University. But as George Orwell once said, some ideas are so stupid that only intellectuals believe them. Unfortunately, this dogma is a stern gatekeeper that prevents us from having meaningful debates about a number of topics in our society today, one of which happens to be immigration. So on the note of immigration, I'd like to give you a little background about myself and actually my family in particular. Both of my parents were immigrants from different places. I am not anti-immigrant, has been so wrongly claimed by the likes of the trashy rags such as the Georgia Strait and the Daily Hive. Not at all. You see, my mother came from Great Britain, and my father and all the members of his family came in 1958 from a part of the world that during most of the 20th century was arguably the worst place on earth to live. They were pretty grateful to come here, but they had experienced the horrors of the extreme right and the horrors of the extreme left almost simultaneously. They had the unfortunate mix of being ethnic Germans living in Russia. So my great-grandfather, a successful farmer, businessman in Russia, experienced the horrors of the extreme left when the communists showed up at his farm in 1922. Luckily, he wasn't home when they came. His wife and children, his 4 children were. Well, the communists shot his wife and 4 children and then confiscated the farm, put it under state control. They collectivized it. They made it equitable. A couple decades later, Second World War arrived at their doorstep. So at this point, I want to shift and tell you specifically about my grandmother's brother, perhaps the toughest man I've ever known. His name was Briss. He died only a few years ago in his late 90s. Well, when the Second World War arrived at their doorstep in Russia, it was the German army that appeared, overran their villages, and that was 1941. He ended up fighting, well, as an ethnic German, although Russian-born citizen. He was conscripted into the German army and then fought at Stalingrad. He survived. As a prisoner of war, he spent the next few years in Russian Gulag, where again he miraculously survived. And he came to Canada, married the woman he had planned on marrying 10 years earlier before that small piece of history got in the way. So in 1992, I asked by letter, when one actually wrote those kinds of things. He was in Winnipeg, I was in Kelowna, and so I asked him about his war experience. And he wrote back. And I want to read a portion of that letter, but before I do, you need to know that Briss had this keen ability to navigate between two worlds. And to understand both. So he understood the world of the extreme left, the communists, and he understood the world of the extreme right, the Nazis. He lived both experiences at the same time. Let me read his letter, because it has bearing on what we are talking about today, freedom of speech. I'm getting a bit old, so I just got these. I was fighting against them. Anyway, he writes back and he says, "We were not tortured or beaten. There was, however, very little to eat. Approximately a third of the prisoners died of starvation. I weighed 90 pounds when I was released. I was interrogated 3 times by the KGB, but treated courteously each time, given a chair, offered a cigarette. The officers questioning me spoke both Russian and German, always discussing first in Russian before translating them to German. I never let on that I could speak Russian, or that I was born and raised in Russia, but it was always nice to know the questions when they were coming before they were translated from German." Anyway, he was in prison camp 7444, right on the edge of the Iranian border. There was 9,000 of them. And the most important part is this little bit. "As I was familiar with the Russian people, their way of life, and communism, the operations of the Russian army were not so strange to me. The German-born Germans, however, who had no contact with this people before, their methods and ideas were totally strange to them, and they had a difficult time trying to understand them." I think most, if not all of you in this crowd tonight, are fans of freedom of speech. Right?
Yes.
Good, because there are those that aren't. And it's important to understand why. History repeats itself. We've come to a moment in time where there are two groups of people, and they don't understand one another. The far left, the social justice warriors, for lack of a better term, speak a certain language, and the rest of us do not. The far left, the social justice warriors, cannot be understood through reason and logic. So it's our duty to try and understand them. And in my estimation, the social justice warrior is made up of 3 ingredients. 3 afflictions might be a better way of saying this. The 3 afflictions are arrogance, self-hatred, and a fatty liver. So I better explain that. Arrogance keeps the social justice warrior from listening to the perspectives of others. But arrogance is actually a surface expression of something deeper, loneliness. And loneliness is prevalent in our society in a way it never has been before, especially since the 1960s. But loneliness has become this kind of norm. And loneliness is the staging ground for arrogance. Loneliness breeds arrogance, and arrogance is the first ingredient of the social justice warrior. The second ingredient, and I think perhaps the most interesting, is the fatty liver. It sounds strange, but according to Eastern medicine, the liver is the storehouse of anger, the emotion of anger. Anger resides in the liver. So let's be clear about anger itself. And anger is actually my favorite emotion. Of all the emotions, anger is my favorite. Mostly because it'll compel someone to do that which they may have been afraid to do before. That could be for good, it could be for bad. It might even get somebody from Mount Royal University to come to UBC and speak, even though people are yelling at them. I love anger. But anger is also an emotional blanket, just like arrogance. It's a mask or it's a disguise, and it covers the true emotions underneath, which are sadness and grief. And sadness and grief have to come somewhere, from somewhere. I think there are a number of important sources of it in our society right now. And one is particularly strong here on the West Coast. I'm actually a British Columbian, I'm not Albertan, by the way. So let me explain by telling you a story. There was a forest that I used to love to go to, about once a year. So I'd hike into it and kind of experience the magic of the old growth forest. And if you've been in an old growth forest, you know what I'm talking about. Well, I would go hike into it every year. I'd climb to the top of the mountain, just beyond, and I'd look down and know that I was a part of the world. I was an individual, but I was also a part of the world. It was kind of a spirituality to it. Can't be explained through religious texts, only through experience. Well, one year I went there, and of course, you know where this is going. It was cut down. Now, I feel like crying. Oh. Anyway, that heartbreak made me sad, and then very angry, incredibly angry, followed by depression. All the classic signs of grief. So the reaction to such destruction is a desire to destroy the perpetrator that did that. But who exactly is the perpetrator? It's not an easy answer. But vengeance always needs a target. So complete destruction of the society itself is often seen as the answer. Dismantle capitalism, dismantle society, dismantle anything that comes in one's way. Just what we have outside. And I can't really blame them. I know that feeling. I know that anger, that loss. So anger dwells in the liver, and it kind of makes it fat and putrid and stinking over gross. But the social justice warriors are a product of that. They're angry, they're sad, and they're suffering. And here on the West Coast, there are a few other places that have such profound natural environments and such profound destruction of them too. So it's no wonder that the social justice warriors of the West Coast tend to be of the environmental kind. Not the only kind, but tend to be the environmental kind here. Now I could go on ad infinitum about the sources of grief and sadness, but I won't. All I can say is it comes through as anger. Third is self-hatred. This seems to be the driving force to me, the power behind the actions of the social justice warriors of the extreme left. Without self-hatred, there can be no action to project onto others what one wishes not to be themselves. Unfortunately, if a person has all three of these afflictions, they become the wounded of society. They're hurt, they're sad, they're angry. They're most angry at themselves. Most importantly for everyone else, they're very, very dangerous. Warning, rational dialogue will not work. Those that oppose freedom of speech are not actually opposed to freedom of speech. What they really want is total destruction. They want vengeance, retribution, revenge. Freedom of speech only gets in the way of that, and that is very dangerous. So we cannot guard against the social justice warrior with logic or reason. We'll never win by holding free speech sessions. I'm not saying stop, please definitely do not, especially at this time when freedom of speech is most under attack. But the battle against the social justice warrior that tries to shut down free speech will not be won through logic or reason. This is a different kind of battle. So when a professor at my own university, don't know if I should say his name or not, writes on Twitter that they can't wait to kill the bourgeoisie in the coming revolution. My professor. They're not joking, they're serious when they say that. And history has taught us that the number of steps from a statement like that to a woman and her 4 children being shot on a farm are very few, frighteningly few. So I believe we have it backwards. We've been dealing with issues such as immigration from the naive emotions and false smiles that say, everyone is welcome, diversity is our strength. When what we really need is cold, hard, rational logic on the immigration file. Meanwhile, we've tried to debate the social justice warriors of the world with logic and facts, when what we really need to do is treat them as the individuals, the wounded individuals that they really are. There are tools that need to be in one's arsenal for this battle with the extreme left, and logic is not one of them. Against the extreme left must be the same tools one would use for a wounded animal. The first is compassion. First is always compassion. But there will be moments, rare as they may be, when you have the ability to reach out in compassion and find common ground. You'll understand the view of another, and they'll understand your view. It'll be rare, but it'll happen. Cherish those moments, but don't be naive. You'll also need, and I say you because each and every one of you in this room is in this, whether you want to be or not. You will need a proverbial shield, and you will need a proverbial sword. So whatever your sword may be is up to you. Joining the Students for Freedom of Expression is a pretty good example of a very powerful sword. So please, remember this if you remember nothing else. In those rare moments when you find common ground, you find compassion with those that are hurting and want to take down the world around them, including with you in it, remember to be realistic. Never lower your shield, and for God's sake, never hide your sword. So I'd like to end by saying how thankful I am to the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression group. So small, so powerful, incredibly important. You're like an oasis among so many delusions right now. Thank you. May the debates carry on.
All right, so first, I also would like to thank Nicholas, Peter, and Rafael. It is very brave of them to invite us here. And you probably know this already, but the most controversial topic that you can talk about in Canada and the whole Western world is why it is that all Western nations are forcing through mass immigration and diversity. They don't want us to talk about that subject. It is true that a few young students here and there get all riled up about transsexuality and so on, but that subject does not threaten the establishment. The subject that they fear the most in ways that are unimaginable, in the sense that they fear it more than communism, is opposition to racial diversity. They want that to happen. This is the first time in the history of Canadian universities that you will hear two academics discussing the downside of diversity. And it may well be the last time if academics are successful in their efforts to classify criticism of diversity as hate speech. And they are really moving in that direction. The establishment does not want you to engage in critical thinking about diversity because this mandated program is packed with deceptions and obfuscations. Here are 3 lies contained in just one key statement. They regularly tell us that Canada, one, is uniquely multicultural. It is not a nation of immigrants, and liberal principles are totally consistent with zero immigration. Citizens across the West, in Sweden, England, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Italy, are being told also that their nations are uniquely multicultural and immigrant nations since prehistoric times. The truth is, most of the men and women who built the West, including Canada, were native to their nations, born in England or Sweden or in Canada. And almost all the men and women who came to Canada before 1914 were settlers, not immigrants. Check any dictionary. They distinguish between a settler who comes to survive in a land sparsely populated and devoid of modern development, and an immigrant who comes to a ready-made nation. Moreover, liberal principles do not mandate nations to import millions of new minorities. Liberalism only requires the recognition of the equal rights of historical minorities already inside the nation. The claim that liberalism requires diversification is a result of the infiltration of liberalism by conniving cultural Marxists who have taken over this way of thinking. We often hear that mass immigration is a necessary component of globalization. Justin Trudeau, in the debate a few days ago, accused Bernier of, quote, trying to make people more fearful about the migrations that are happening in the world, the opportunities around globalization, end of quote. This is the view academics have been pushing onto white students for decades. They want them to believe that the undemocratic imposition of multiculturalism is outside the West are intra-regional. They are moving in response to crises at home, moving from one bordering nation to another in Asia or Latin America. The ones moving to such nations as the United Arab Emirates are temporary labor migrants, and they're basically coming into these oil-rich nations to just clean them, clean the toilets, because anyway, the people there, they're not working that much, they're so rich. So they bring in Pakistanis and other people to do all the dirty work. But they're not getting citizenship. Now, if we are properly to understand the meaning of globalism and why immigrant multiculturalism has become a cult in the West, we need to frame this debate within the wider ideological framework of cultural Marxism. Since academics tend to confuse cultural Marxism with Marxism per se, or some Hegelian or New Left version of Marxism, let me clarify that by this term, I understand the spread after World War II of a wide variety of theories, movements, influential ideas and names, such as feminism, dependency theory. Dependency theory is a very important component of this ideology. It says that the reason Western nations became wealthy is because they stole resources and exploited slaves. It is not true. They did do that, but that's not why they became wealthy. Otherwise, Rome would have industrialized. Otherwise, Spain, which has one of the greatest empires in history, would have industrialized. Switzerland had no colonies, Sweden had no colonies, Norway no colonies, Germany one, and yet they became very advanced industrial nations without any colonies. So cultural Marxism includes as well history from below, you probably don't know what that is, the Frankfurt School, deconstruction, Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, Michel Foucault's new historicism. It is not that all these schools of thought are devoid of merit. Well, most of them are, but I do find Foucault's claim that, quote, every field of knowledge presupposes at the same time a field of power relations, end of quote, particularly relevant to understand the incredible field of power relations held by cultural Marxism over every aspect of Western society. The center of gravity of this field of knowledge of cultural Marxism is the claim that races don't exist, that racism is the worst moral crime a white human being can commit, and that Western nations have always been institutionally racist in their systematic discrimination against minorities, and in the special privileges that white heterosexual men have enjoyed against racialized minorities, women and homosexuals. This cultural Marxist field of knowledge has included, more recently, the idea that Western nations with a strong sense of cultural identity are inherently illiberal, and that liberalism requires mass immigration and racial diversity. The field of power relations associated with this field of knowledge is overwhelmingly obvious in the swift disciplinary punishment any dissenter against this knowledge faces in the West. It is not an exaggeration to say that immigrant multiculturalism is the most important component of cultural Marxism, insofar as racial diversification is the most transformative force of our times and possibly in history, because it will forever destroy the millennial racial ancestries of European peoples. The left in the 1960s did not consciously set out in a programmatic fashion to push diversity as the biggest weapon to undermine Western culture, but a weapon it has become. In the early 1840s, Karl Marx identified the working class as the one revolutionary agent that would bring about a society without divisions based on collective communism. But this class was too attached to its national identities and rather happy with the capitalist prosperity that came after the 1850s. This prompted the left to look for other agents to bring about their revolution. Lenin looked to a revolutionary vanguard. Mao looked to the peasants. Che Guevara looked to third world peoples or third world revolutions. And the new left and postmodernists looked to women, blacks, aboriginals, and transsexuals. But there is no question that today the left, together with the right, has come to envision immigrants as the most powerful revolutionary agent, less as a political agent than as a demographic racial force that can transform all white nations into post-national states. That's my first topic. I won't get to all of them. I'll stop when my time runs out. Here's the second topic, the Great Replacement. The promoters of mass immigration, the same individuals who celebrate the increasing ethnic diversity in the West, tell us that the phrase, the Great Replacement, is part of a white genocide conspiracy theory. They're even trying to persuade state authorities that this phrase should be banned or made illegal because, quote, it motivates alt-right killers the world over. Meanwhile, the globalist, Marxist-controlled internet is full of articles celebrating the replacement of whites. In the case of the United States, for example, we regularly read that, quote, the white share of the US population has been dropping from a little under 90% in 1950 to 60% in 2018, and that it will drop below 50% in the next 25 years. And they say that America will never be white again, and that America is on its way to becoming predominantly non-white. So they say as a good thing. So they do admit that there is a replacement going on. Even Stats Canada, which is supposed to be very objective, without ideological agendas, regularly inserts celebratory phrases about the impending replacement of white Canadians. After making projections about how mass immigration from non-European countries is leading to a dramatic reduction in the proportions of, quote, Caucasians in race, StatsCan happily informs us that, quote, immigrants and their descendants, in addition to contributing to the social and economic development of the country, play a significant role in shaping and enriching the ethnic, cultural composition of the Canadian population. The logic of this argument is incredibly racist, for it equates increasing the proportion of non-Caucasians in race with cultural enrichment, which amounts to the view that a Canada with a declining white population and a rising non-white population is a Canada undergoing cultural enrichment. These are the replacement projections Stats Canada announced in the 2016 census. We don't have time to go over all of them, so I'm just going to cut it short. By the year 2036, that's not long from now, the working age population, ages 15 to 64, that is not European, could be as high as 40%. By 2031, 63% of the population of Toronto, 59% of Vancouver, and 31% of Montreal will be non-white in color. And I'm using the words that Stats Canada uses. They do believe that races exist. Don't believe them on that too. It's one lie after another lie of these people. And their lies are happening at the highest levels of our society. Canada as a whole, based on current immigration patterns, we are told, will be almost 80% non-white in less than a century, or 20% white, 65%. Leave it at that. Members of the media and art universities are unaware that a very highly regarded academic demographer, Professor David Coleman of Oxford, was the first one to offer a statistically based projection of the Great Replacement. Coleman is British by ethnicity, and England has produced the greatest demographers, and they happen to be the country that first had a census of its population way back in 1086. Coleman, in an article that has been cited over 500 times, and he did get a lot of slack for this. In fact, he has backed away from this kind of research. He is afraid. But in that article, and he's the author of 40 papers and 8 books, in that article he said that in 2010 that white British would make up less than half the population in little more than 50 years. So we're not just talking about Canada. And he has written other papers that we don't have time to cite. Now, since there are some people who say, look, replacement can't possibly be going on because races don't exist. So I'll say this. If race is a construct, how does Stats Canada identify, quote, Caucasians by race? Or non-whites in color? Likewise, by what criteria does the media and our academics talk about racial discrimination and oppression by whites unless they can identify them? We know the story. Races really do exist in a cultural Marxist world, but it goes like this. If you say something positive about whites, whites don't exist. If you say something negative, for sure they exist. If you say something negative about blacks, they don't exist. If you say something positive, yes, celebrate it. That's the logic of their argument when they talk about races. Defining the meaning of race is not very complicated. There are many books about it. I mentioned one. Edward Dutton published a book just last year called Race Differences in Ethnocentrism. He has a PhD and has published in very prominent scientific journals. And basically what he says is that race is employed to refer to what in the animal kingdom would be a subspecies. That is, a breeding population separated from another of the same species long enough to have evolved noticeably distinct traits, adaptable to a different environment, but not long enough to be able to reproduce with other races. So it's just a matter of different environments. Let's assume that human beings came from Africa. Well, they dispersed and moved into Europe, to Asia. Those are different environments that exercise different selective pressures that result not only in different physical characteristics, but in different behavioral and psychological differences. We are different in psychology as well. All right, I still have 10 minutes, right? So the third topic is the convergence of the left and the right. Both the left and the right are continuously frightening their students about some impending demographic catastrophe unless European nations accept higher levels of immigration. The left approaches this issue from a slightly different angle. The left focuses on human rights and the equalization of human outcomes across the world. The left believes that all humans in the world have a human right to be citizens of Western nations, and that Western peoples should become global citizens, rather than citizens of a particular nation state. And the left views the mere existence of nations with a white majority population as a supremacist reality that must be destroyed in the name of an international socialist brotherhood. There's a real sense in which the fact that Norway has majority whites and is successful for the left, that is an infraction against equality, that is a supremacist reality, and it must be brought down. The focus on the right, as you know, is more on businesses. And I, again, don't have too much time to get into it, but the right emphasizes a lot increases in the gross domestic product. There was a time when economists in the West would talk about per capita income increasing simultaneously with increases in population and increases in gross output, but they don't that much anymore. The focus is simply on increases in gross domestic output. The right actually cherishes docile leftist consumers and workers without a strong national identity who can identify with any generic global brand. In that sense, they don't feel threatened by the left. CEOs love academic ideas. Don't let your professors think that they are so in a state of struggle with CEOs and that stuff. No, the banks love them. They love the ideas about inclusiveness, all that stuff, diversity. Just check it. Google TD, diversity, transsexuals. I mean, they're celebrating that stuff every day. So they like the idea of a universal in-group identity, a we without outsiderness, in which humans from all races and sexual orientations become equally attached to their banks, Facebook pages, Google searches, and Twitter accounts, all the while inciting young people to have a hateful disposition against any white person who says it is okay to be white. The looming demographic disaster that they talk about and that the left agrees about is that the West is facing diminishing levels of economic growth due to declining proportions in the working age population as a result of fertility rates persistently below replacement levels. They argue that our current average fertility rate of 1.3, 1.5 children in combination with an aging population with a continuously rising life expectancy is creating an unsustainable dependency ratio. That is, the proportion of the working age is shrinking, whereas the proportion of the retired age is expanding. And they say that not only will this bring a slowdown in economic growth, but, and leftists like this, as people become seniors, they're not going to be getting their pensions with the same security, they're not going to be taken care of in the senior caring centers, and so we need immigration to sustain our social programs. So they have concluded that the existing levels of immigration are not high enough. You see this already with Harper. Harper's levels of immigration were going up, then Trudeau kept them up, and they're calling for even higher. They're saying things like Europe needs, I don't have the number right now here, but 100 million immigrants to enrich itself. Now, just a final point here. Why is this argument being made about Western nations only when other advanced nations are facing exactly the same demographic crisis, if you want to call it a crisis? Japan has an aging population, more so than Canada. In Japan, the proportion of people over 65 years old is 28%. In Canada, it is 15.6%. So the gap between the working population and the retired population is wider in Japan. And yet Japan is not saying that we should open our borders. So why is that? Well, because Japan, to go to my initial point, is not dominated by cultural Marxism. That ideology does not dominate their nation, are proud of their heritage, are proud of who they are. So they're finding different solutions. In addition to certain policies that they hope will make it easier for families to have children by expanding child care and offering tax incentives to families, the Japanese leadership has decided to intensify its already automated economy. openly stating that an aging population, quote, is not a burden, but an incentive to boost productivity through innovations like robotics, wireless sensors, and artificial intelligence. Yes, Japan recently decided to allow 340,000 foreign workers, but again, on a temporary basis, and they're not getting citizenship. So there's no way. I know some academics out there say, oh no, look at that Japan, or students, look, they're immigrant too. No, they're deceiving you. They're not going to be given citizenship, and it's temporary. Automation is a reality not just in Japan, it's happening in the West. I have statistics here about the estimations as to how many people will lose their jobs in the service sector and other low-skill sectors. So when you talk about increasing immigration because of a declining fertility rate, you have to talk about automation as well. Then we have the Prime Minister of Hungary. He has very clearly stated that he is not going to replace Hungarians with immigrants. We are simply going to produce more Hungarian children by encouraging larger families. And they have all kinds of incentives, even buying big cars. If you have like 5 children, you get a free big car. And just one last point here. I could go over the cost of immigrants. There are statistics by Herbert Gruber that demonstrate that the cost of immigrants, in terms of what they add to Canada, the costs are higher. But we could also point to Sweden or point to Germany. In Sweden, a survey just came out. 1 out of every 4 young women is afraid now to go out on the streets by herself when it starts to get a bit dark. This is a feminist nation of the world. If you tell a feminist that, they'll just walk away and say, I'm not interested. You tell them, no, the white guards are was my threat. Oh, no, please, let's take note. But the moment you say, no, they're immigrant, oh, come on, that's not big deal. And just today, I read that it cost France something like $30 billion to assimilate immigrants into their own nation. I mean, the numbers you can't keep track. They're very, very high. So this idea that immigration does not cost, it costs a lot in economic terms, and it certainly costs a lot in cultural terms. And I'm going to stop there.
Just a quick update. There's no one out there right now. Everyone left. Hopefully they don't come back. But security and RCMP are still out there, so it should be okay. I forgot to say this before, but I'd like to thank security for keeping us safe. I don't think even... Now we're going to move on to, before we move on to the question period, person who wrote the letter, you're not here, right? Yeah, he's not here because he was actually bringing his baby, and I don't think he would have ever made it through those people. But I have this letter here, so I'm going to read it for him, and then we're going to move on to question period.
Duchesne,
I'm sorry?
could you hold the mic closer to your mouth?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Since 1971, Canada has led the world of course, imperfectly, but nevertheless, in adopting multiculturalism as official policy with its focus on the equality, dignity, and freedom of all people, regardless of cultural, religious, racial, etc. distinctives. And this progress is rightly seen as a natural, though not inevitable, outgrowth of the promises of classical liberal thought. And multicultural immigration is a great benefit for Canada, though of course deep analysis is required for the specific numbers Canada can adequately welcome and integrate per given year, and not every country does either multi or monocultural immigration right, as not only reasoned but also demonstrated by the evidence, because, number one, economically, it gives Canada the widest of nets for attracting skilled and/or sector-specific needed workers through its controlled merit-based system, which is especially needed for an aging population whose deaths outnumber births. Number two, culturally, the Mosaic model forms a flexible, durable unity of core values that's not dependent on maintaining often arbitrary standards, especially given that ethnicity or a human population's specific physiological phenomena need not be inextricably bound to cultural or national norms, such that any race, European or not, to be explicit for the speakers, can become authentically Canadian. Three, socially, the diversity it entails by its very design fosters acceptance, respect, and curiosity in other people, making it a key vehicle for breakthrough innovation and the generation of novel ideas, and of course, great varieties of cuisine and beverages, which reaps tremendous benefits in today's globalized and connected world. He didn't direct it, and he didn't want to be in particular, so.
Have them both answer.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can go first.
Do you have the both mic?
So I left.
oh, you can.
Okay, where to start with that? We could theoretically have an immigration system that says we take people in from absolutely everywhere in the world, and we have this large sort of melting pot system. And there's, in one sense, there's nothing wrong with that. In one sense, we actually know that, as I mentioned before, some diversity does actually lead to innovation, sense of new ideas, even a little bit of increase in productivity. And when I say diversity, I guess we need to define diversity first of all. So diversity could mean linguistic diversity, it could mean religious diversity, it could mean ethnic diversity, but then when you get into ethnic diversity, what are you talking about? Do you include racial categorization into that? So it's important to identify or clarify what we mean by diversity first of all. I'm going to use Alesina's definition, which really refers to fractionalization, which is ethnic diversity, which is closest to cultural diversity. And that one doesn't take into account this idea of race. It just says we have different cultures around the world, and they're often associated, not purely, but often associated with a nation. So culturally, we could say there's the British, and there's the Brazilians, and the Uruguayans, and so on. So if we take that idea into account, then we also know that each of those nations have their own cultural values. And the research says that if you want to use a good parameter for identifying who is most compatible, values tend to be the best one to look at. And so then how do you identify values? Well, the World Values Survey, which has been running since 1981, pretty clearly identifies along two dimensions different values. So there's the values of traditional versus secular values across one dimension, and across the other dimension is self-expression versus survival. And so if you look at Canada, we fit pretty far along the self-expression dimension. We don't really live in this kind of survival value dimension. And on the other one, we're pretty high in terms of rational thought as opposed to traditional thought. So if you use values as a parameter for deciding who is most compatible, then you would look at that and say, oh, well, the closest countries to us would be Denmark, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland. Those would be the most compatible people with us. However, you could say, well, maybe we don't just want those people, we want a little more cultural diversity. So you could go farther down these dimension lines. And in that case, you get to interesting anomalies like Slovenia and Hong Kong both have the same values. They sit both in the same spot. If you go to the farthest dimension, the ones that are least compatible with Canada, you get places like Russia and China, mainland China. You could theoretically say, let's take everyone and just have this melting pot. That's fine. But just know that you're going to have a lot of people that are not going to have very similar values, and it's going to be difficult to integrate them. As long as you know that, that's fine.
I mean, the view that this person expressed is the view you hear every single day, and you read about it in the newspaper every day. Justin Trudeau says that all the time. The problem with this view is what I said at the beginning of the paper, is you cannot understand why diversity is happening in Canada unless you broaden the debate as to why it is that Germany, England, Italy, Spain are all pushing the same idea. It's not just Canada, it's all of them as well. I went to Italy about 7 years ago, and at that point I wasn't thinking about immigration that much. And as I'm driving buses, I see these big posters of people of different races, and it says, we are all Italian, and I'm like, what is going on here? I thought I had just left Toronto, and it's like I'm back there again. I went to Sweden, it's the same thing. Germany, the same thing. So you have to be aware of the global reality of diversity, but that it is only happening in the West. If you can't ask that question, you won't understand what is happening. Now, once you ask that question, why it is happening only in white-created nations, then you take it to another level. That we are dealing here with something that has to do with the white race. I'm sorry, but that is a crucial piece of the puzzle, right in the middle of the puzzle. The other thing is that many people, you walk around and you see some Chinese girls and white guys, and they're having a nice time and laughing, and you go, oh, look, it works, it's so cute. That kind of reality at the everyday life is not the way to approach this issue. You have to go to the top. Who's pushing this? Who are the globalist leaders that are pushing this? The banks, the powerful people, the academics who are very powerful intellectually that are pushing.
15 times is great per capita, and you'll just destroy the world by taking these immigrants from the third world. So we should only take immigrants from other wealthy countries.
Yeah.
Okay, if you're interested in the environment. With respect to bringing people in because we need to pay for the pensions for the elderly and the Medicare, this has got to be the dumbest Ponzi scheme I've ever heard. What happens when these people who are now 25 become 65, and there's 5 times as many of them?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the argument is absolutely absurd. And the other thing is, the other push for immigration is the business community. It's the Marxist on the left and the business community on the right. You know, more people, more real estate, more customers, more. The young people better smarten up, because if they ever want to buy a house in Vancouver or Edmonton or any of these places, you've got to quit taking in more and more immigrants.
Sir, we want to prioritize this agreement right now. If people who disagree, please raise your hands. But you, are you going to criticize them, or you just have a general
I
question?
agree with most of what he said, but I just wanted to add the analogy of Dr. Duchesne was talking about how like warring tribes, it gives us the legitimacy to come over here because they were already warring. that I could draw the analogy to Europe. Most of Europe has been a constant turmoil for millennia. But that doesn't give other people from different ethnicities and places of origin the right to come and take over Europe. So how would you reconcile that with the argument that we have the right to come here because the natives have always been warring and conquering their...
I didn't say that. I didn't say that Europeans have a right to come here because for legitimate...
Or we have the right to stay here, I guess because we've developed.
Yeah, I did say that they have a right to belong in the nation that they created.
Okay, I agree.
But not they had a right to colonize this land. I didn't say that. That just happens to be the case throughout history because life, before affluence came in the last few decades, life was a constant struggle for survival. If people today, those academics there that work 10 hours a week, if you put them back in time to survive in Canada with the ideas they have, they just wouldn't survive a week. The natives would just eat them. I mean, this is just ridiculous nonsense that you can actually create a nation state with Marxist feminist ideas. They always fail. Wherever the hippies tried some of this, complete failure of those communes. They didn't even know who's going to throw the garbage. Simple things like that. How can you communally throw the garbage? It always gets into dispute. A guy is sleeping too long, the other guy's making noise anyway. It just didn't work. And in the Soviet Union, communism didn't work. And this is not working. In Sweden, it's billions of dollars they're paying. Women are being sexually assaulted continuously in Sweden, in England, in Germany. And many boys too get beaten up all the time. Especially if boys in Norway come from single feminist mothers, there is no way those boys are going to survive against the more patriarchal extended families of the immigrants coming from Muslim countries.
You raised your hand before? Yeah. Ricardo and Mark, if you could keep your answers short. The police is asking, they're saying they want to leave soon.
My question is directed to Mark. You seem quite proud of the fact that your family history, that they lived in sort of a divided community in Russia. I want to know what you think of self-segregation since that subject wasn't brought up.
Self-segregation as in my German family was living in Russia, segregated? Yeah. That's a pretty complicated one, but one could argue that their self-segregation led to them, to the people that they lived around hating them and eventually kicking them out. It's complicated, but they don't want to think of it that way. When I bring it up with my aunts and uncles, they don't want to think of it that way. But certainly, the people who they lived around. Exactly. Yeah. No, I definitely see it when you segregate yourself or isolate yourself into your own ethnic community. I need to go a little farther. I would say that they were actually quite arrogant. They were Mennonites who thought of themselves as being a little bit superior to everyone else around them. And so that self-segregation essentially led to the people around them not liking them very much. And so when they had the ability to do so, especially during the war, they took every advantage they could to get rid of the Mennonites, my family. And so I think you see that often in countries where if you do have people that are self-segregated, they're going to face possibly retribution at some point in history. That's pretty nasty to say. I've seen it in my own family. Next question.
Hello, this is for Dr. Duchesne. I just found a bit of an inconsistency in your argument when you stated that Canada could solve the problem of an aging population in the same way that Hungary is trying to do with having just more babies by locals, is a little bit incongruent with your argument about population control in regards to environmentalism. Don't you think there's enough people on this earth that we don't need to be creating like extra people, and that we could better use the already existing skilled laborers in this country, and that like, global emissions affect everybody, and just because these people making emissions aren't in Canada doesn't mean they don't affect us in Canada.
Well, I wasn't being inconsistent. If the argument is that Canada's economy, if it is to avoid a demographic crisis, has to have a growing population, then you can counter that we could do some of the things Hungary is doing. And by the way, I don't think it's easy. I don't think that the reason why couples are not having children is just because of feminism or things like that. I think it's part of every society that becomes quite affluent. It happened in Roman times. In Roman times, there was no feminism, but couples start having as many children once they have affluence, which seems odd. But my point is, if you're going to argue that you need a higher population, why don't you just then encourage your own people to have more children, rather than automatically say that all import foreigners so that they can do the work. And I agree with environmentalists. It's not something that I have a clear answer about, but I have no problems with an environmentalist who says, you know what, we don't really need to keep having population growth. We can stabilize it, we can extend the year of retirement to 70 years old, and so on and so forth. So you could go either way.
All right, we're having some trouble finding disagreeers, so we had the idea of asking you for about 5 minutes to say what you would disagree with each other, and then we will continue with the questions starting with you. But for now, what do you not agree with the other?
We got one.
What you got? You disagree? Yes. All right. Right after him, we'll get to you.
So it's a two-part question. The first part of which being, it's not a direct disagreement with anything that you said per se, but I wanted to ask if the West has an obligation to take refugees that are a victim of its foreign policy, and if meddling in foreign, and second part is, do you believe that meddling in foreign wars, especially in the Middle East, is contributing to the refugee crisis?
All right. Yes, I mean, our side, the dissident right, we don't agree with the neocon invasions of other nations. So we don't feel responsible for that. However, even then, I wouldn't argue, because refugees don't come only from military interventions, they come for many other reasons as well. I wouldn't argue that the West has a moral obligation to accept refugees on an ongoing basis. Like, I have no problem, let's say in the case of the Syrians, that they would come, but only if Canada was not under the domination of this cultural Marxist ideology, which brings 300,000 plus immigrants per year. So if we had a Canada in which you only get 10,000 immigrants a year and the Syrians are facing a crisis, yes, I would have no problems with them arriving. But the refugee situation is part of a wider set of other things that the people at the top do to diversify white nations. I do believe that there is, at this point in time, you only have to watch television, news, movies, an obsession with diversifying the West, and it is not pending on refugees or pending on that crisis or that foreign war. Those are small things in comparison to the fact that 320,000 arrived in Canada, a whole bunch to Australia, and so on and so forth. And that the whole curriculum, primary schools, the universities, all of them are now shaped in such a way that they promote this.
Perhaps we have a moral obligation, but every country has to, first of all, be practical about what it needs and what it's doing. So I would say practicality trumps morality.
All right, before we move on to the questions, what do you each disagree with each other?
I think he said already, right?
I think the basic premise that was being brought up by Ricardo, this idea that the narrative that Canada is an immigrant nation is not quite right. But instead, that we essentially have a group of Europeans that showed up and then have essentially replicated themselves over hundreds of years and created fairly distinct societies. I mean, that's what we can talk about with Quebec. Quebec is a distinct society. And I think we also have that in English Canada. So that basic premise, I think, I hadn't really thought about it until I started listening to Ricardo, and I think he's onto something there that's quite valid. I think perhaps where I disagree is, where are we going from here forward? And I think we have slightly different views on that.
Could you elaborate?
Me?
Yeah, could you elaborate on the differences, on where do you take this?
I think Ricardo sees this more as an issue centered around the idea of race, and I see this more as an issue centered around cultural compatibility, which I don't necessarily define as race.
All right. I guess we'll move on to just. Oh, I'm sorry, you were going to move on. What? Were you going to say something?
No,
all right, just general questions now. And you raise your hand way before.
So I wanted to disagree with Mark a little bit about his analysis of the social justice mindset. And that I think, and I used to be one of those people out there, speaking from experience. For me, it was a really powerful central thought of the blank slate, and believing that all groups of people are fundamentally the same, and it's all social constructivism. And in a world where different groups are achieving different outcomes, that can only mean injustice. So their moral compass is actually working properly. It's just on a flawed premise. They mean well. They just believe that all races and all genders and everybody are the same, so we should all get to the same place. They're fighting against injustice. So I didn't really hear that in your analysis. The other thing that I probably agree with Dr. Duchesne on is that culture is a product of race, or if you don't want to call it race, you can call it genetics. In that, and I think that your Mark's cultural compatibility or cultural distance sort of model is just a euphemism for the genetics of race. Race being a fuzzy concept. And so what we're looking at in Canada with the mass immigration and the increase in ethnic diversity is inevitably we will lose our culture. We can't sustain our cultural ideas and our values without sustaining the ethnic composition of our society. It's not, like, the ideas themselves won't just sustain themselves. They come from us as a people. That's my belief.
Sorry, but there was someone at the back that raised their hand way back.
I don't come back down.
Hey, first of all, I just want to say thanks both of you for coming out. Obviously, thanks for the Student Freedom of Expression for putting this on. My question is directed toward Mr. Duchesne. I talked to a couple of protesters outside today, and they brought up something you said from 2017, saying that, let me get this a little bit off, but white men need to take Canada back, or white men need to stand up and take back the West, something along those lines. And they were really upset by this because they thought that you were insinuating a race war. So I gotta ask, A, are you insinuating a race war? And B, what would be your solution to the Great Replacement? And where do you see Canada in, say, the 22nd century if we keep going down the path that we're going down now? Thanks.
Well, that's three questions. The passage that they use is in the HuffPost.
Microphone.
The passage that they cited to you, the Huffington Post also cited it, but the HuffPost did not indicate where that passage came from, and it came from an article that I wrote in 2017. And the title of that article was, "There is nothing that the alt-right can do about the effeminacy of white men." So what I did in that article was to go over history and to identify points in history in which men were emasculated. So it wasn't really because of feminism, I argue, because the Greeks, when they were rising, would look at the Persians, who had been the foremost empire for a while, and they look at the Persians and would say, those Persians are very effeminate. They like to lie down in mattresses, bring their banquets, drink a lot. They're not sturdy farmers like us who rise early in the morning, limit our sex and so on. But then eventually the Romans would look at the Greeks and even didn't want the Greeks to come to their lands and would say, these Greeks are too studious and bookish, and we Romans are tough, we don't need them here, and look how effeminate they have become. Well, eventually the Romans, and you can look at the images of Caligula, his face, and look at the image of Cato. It's dramatically different. Cato was a man who rose up very early in the morning, had a very disciplined life, raised a large family, worked the land, and even when he rose to a high position in the army, he would eat with his soldiers, he would eat his food cold, he didn't want no easy food like that, and his face is full of ruggedness and toughness. Caligula is, very effeminate, soft, and so on. So it kind of struck me that this has been going on in history, and there are cycles. The moment a civilization goes up, and if it does go up, it has to be strong patriarchal rule, strong men to bring it up. Once they get to the top, the weakness starts kicking in. It happens among families. The children of very wealthy men who were tough at one point, their male boys eventually are too comfortable, and for that reason, very effeminate. They lost their authority. And feminism does play a role in the sense that it accentuates it, it legitimizes it. It says it's really good, and it takes it to an extreme with transsexuals and all that stuff. So that is happening in the West. So I ask myself, why is it that Western men, even when they hear that their women are being sexually assaulted in England from town to town to town, in Sweden, they're not doing much about it. So it wasn't an ideological issue, because believe me, if you do that, if white men were to assault Muslim women or Chinese women, the way white women have been assaulted, they would rise up because they still have a slightly higher degree of masculinity. They're just not going to allow that. So I'm asking myself, why is that? So it's a cyclical phenomenon. And then I argue that what will happen is that ongoing immigration is going to exacerbate the situation, make things worse and worse. And then the easygoing males who think they can just drive nice cars and have nice meals, and that's what life is about, that life will start to dissipate and disappear, and then you're going to get strong men. And these strong men will start fighting back, and that's what I mean, that things are going to get. I'm not advocating race war, I'm saying that the history of cycles says that that may well be the future. To the other questions that you're saying, I don't know what's going to happen in 2200 Canada. If trends continue, it doesn't, you know, I was talking about trends in the next 2 decades. But certainly, Canada is the one nation that I think will least fight back against its disappearance as a nation. I think that I cannot see how the Italians and the Germans can just allow themselves to be extinguished from history. It would be an incredible tragedy. Without the Germans are the core of Europe. Without them, we have no Europe. Everything starts to fall down. And I, of the view that I hope the Germans will eventually toughen up and rise up and stand up for their land.
Are you reading? No, I want. Okay, I will get to you. I just found a couple disagreements, so I will do. I'm really sorry, but we have to prioritize them. So one people who disagrees, then you over here, then the other person, and then.
Hi. As Raphael said, I'm a disagreeer. I'm probably a minority here in this room. But I am not here to change your mind about your idea. I just have one quick question. Is that when you talk about the language that you use when you describe people like in the third world, immigrants, indigenous people, it's quite undermined. You kind of undermine them. You are saying they're irrational, so there's no point of having a discourse with them. They won't be resonated. So my question is, how is this language that you use, how do you make peace with contributing to white supremacy, or at least sparking violence? Because even if we do not agree with all of our ideas and value here, the consequence of this kind of hate speech, as people label, has quite a lot of consequences. As myself, I'm an immigrant here, I would feel very unsafe in a room like this if I knew that this kind of speech was targeted to specific people like me.
I'm an immigrant who came in being called a Nazi.
No heckling, no.
That's not heckle. I was told Nazis come for being white.
Just let him answer the question.
Who do you want to answer that question?
Oh, either of you is fine.
Just take it.
Can you clarify the question?
Your ideas are dangerous, is what she's saying. And how will you
She
justify?
feels left out from this kind of conversation. She feels like, so what am I? As an immigrant, are you saying that there is something wrong with me?
No, and even in the idea that you put forward, even if I agree or not, have real consequences in our life, where a lot of people will feel in danger, as they will feel vulnerable. They will feel unsafe at least, and I think this is why a lot of people don't feel like coming here debating this against you. I would like to think that is that.
Well, in my speech, I said that every country needs to, or certainly Canada, needs to take a very rational approach to immigration. That, for me, that doesn't target people individually. But it's very practical, and practicality is not always kind. For example, my own father, which I talked about, he fled Europe. He was on a boat with another 3,000 people, and they asked to come to Canada and the United States. And both Canada and the United States said, no, you can go elsewhere. So they did. They went to Paraguay for 10 years before Canada then said, okay, we'll give you a try. And so then they came to Canada. And that wasn't Canada being mean on an individual level or trying to upset anybody. It was just, it's a very practical, it's a geopolitical practicality that the country took. So if you happen to be somebody that gets rejected, sure, you're going to take it personally.
Oh no, I'm not talking about personal or individual. I mean, if you said you don't see this as a race issue and you're not a racist, but this contributes a lot to racism and white supremacy.
In what way?
I think what she means is that, like, what do you feel are the consequences of, like, having these kinds of conversations when, like, a lot of people who are racist will use the kind of rhetoric that you give out as a way of, like, masking their racism. So this doesn't necessarily have to do with you or people that believe in, like, the same values that you believe in, but more about, like, another group that uses your identity to, like, spread that racism. I think that's what it's about.
Uses his language.
Yeah.
Can you define racism?
Yeah, one at a time.
I think it's pretty much.
Yeah, I'll try and answer the question. I think it's interesting that the people that were outside are the ones that are agreeing with you, and they're trying to fight bad people and racist people, and that's how they behave to express how good they are. Whereas here we are taking your viewpoint, which is different, and we don't think that you should be shouted down.
Yeah,
if I say what you say from your perspective, if I say what I'm saying here in a forum of leftists, they do, it has happened, they start shouting at me, like, shut up and get out of here. I won't say that to you. So that shows the difference between...
Like, I'm here, I'm listening to you, I'm being respectful.
Yeah.
I think it's unfair for you to put me in the same group as the protesters outside.
I didn't say you were, I'm just saying...
No, you said, like, you're grouping us together, right?
Yeah.
I'm separate, like, I'm not protesting outside.
And the other answer that I would give is that just because you feel uncomfortable, it does not mean that whites should allow themselves to be replaced. Because that is where the trend is going.
Yeah, like, again, that's not what we're talking about.
You see,
We can
whites
move on
are
to
only
another question.
13% of the population in the world.
Yeah, no, I heard your speech. I thought it was, like, really good. This is a different question. I was just trying to clarify what I think she was saying. But, like, I don't think we're talking about the same thing, so I think we should just move on to the question.
I agree.
I'd like to answer that. Can we just still come back?
I will come back to you. You have a different question?
Yeah.
All right. Answer that.
Yeah, let him answer.
Sure.
I'm just going to give this a quick try, and maybe this is what you're referring to or what you're feeling. Is I think that what Ricardo and Marco here are talking about, yes, we're talking about white culture, but we're talking about culture, not race. People are coming into Canada, they're not integrating or assimilating or embracing our culture. So there's the issue of sovereignty, where we're saying Japan gets to hang on to their culture and their sovereignty. Canada's not having that opportunity anymore. So people that are coming in who may be of a different race are being asked to integrate and assimilate into our culture. And there's a big divide there. And that's what's causing nations to be built within our nation. People are dividing, they're not coming together in unity. So it's not a matter about the color of your skin or, you may have an accent when you speak. It's about, do you embrace this country's wonderful culture and what it was founded on?
Were you going to answer? Sorry, it's just.
Just go to the critical question. Just go to the critical question. Go to the critical question. That guy, No. That guy behind you.
Behind me?
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about.
No, I'm talking about the guy with the glasses.
I don't know what you're talking about. I gotta get on it now.
I'm just going to
Oh,
respond to this lady here.
give it to that guy there. He's had his hand up for a long time.
I'm just going to respond to this lady here in 1 minute. I noticed twice in this challenge, both by the lady and the gentleman there, the word racism was brought up.
Yeah.
Now, that's an interesting one. At one time, it was the highest virtue to be a patriot, to stand up for your race, to defend it, to defend its interests, and particularly to defend its sovereignty and its existence. Nowadays, racism, patriotism, from being the highest virtue, has become the lowest crime. It's now called racism. So when you say racism, what you really mean is patriotism. Now, if either of you were to go in the millions to India, they wouldn't be so polite with you. They would definitely say, you are not of our race, and we want to preserve this land for our race. They would say it specifically. And you're saying that he shouldn't even say that. He shouldn't say minority, he shouldn't say different. What you are demanding is for white Canadians to not even be able to speak for themselves. You are demanding that white Canadians be slaves and shut their mouths like slaves, because the definition of a slave is he who is afraid to speak his thoughts. But I don't think that they will accept being slaves and then from there on accept their extinguishing their genocide. I don't think so. They will speak and they will have to say, my race, the white race, your race, the Filipino race, there's nothing wrong with that.
One more question, and Mr. Duchesne, I'd like to ask this question. Do you think the concept of Pioneer Little Europe is a good way to, what's the right word for it, relieve racial tensions?
What?
The concept of Pioneer Little Europe.
I don't know what you mean, pioneer?
Pioneer Little Europe. It's optional segregation. Do you know what a plea is? Pioneer Little Europe? That concept?
Pioneer Little Europe.
Yes.
So,
Never heard of it.
Never heard of Pioneer Little Europe?
never heard of that. What does that mean anyway?
Pioneer Little Europe. It's basically a collection of white people who want to have their own white community.
Oh, okay.
It's like optional segregation.
All right, yeah.
It's not like it's not like beating up anyone of a minority or like skinheads beating people up or anything like that. It's just simply a collective of white people living amongst other white people in
Yes.
harmony.
Yeah, that's happening. I mean, it's called white flight.
Yes.
It's happening in cities. Liberals themselves eventually run away from their own diversity at a certain point because they want to be among whites. And it's called implicit because they don't say it openly. They just say, oh, I like the trees here, I like the air. But what they like is that there are more whites out there, but they won't say it. So yeah, there are people in Europe, I mean England, for example, has a very high level of emigration, particularly from London, and not just to the center of the city. They're leaving the whole country because they want to escape the disaster that London has become. So yeah, there is that kind of white flight going on.
It's also happening in Vancouver too, with a lot of whites leaving the
Right.
area, moving to the Sunshine Coast, the island,
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Because eventually very diverse cities become hellholes.
It's not like we want to like be a Nazi or a KKK.
No,
We
it's
wanna
just,
live amongst our
it
own
just
kind.
doesn't work. It doesn't work. Some diversity is good. That's besides the point. Yeah, that's besides the point. You know, you can have a glass or wine. If you drink 2 bottles every night, it's not going to be good.
All right, I'm sorry to be the party pooper, but security says we just can't keep going, and we have to end the event now. If you have any questions, please ask Duchesne
Yeah,
and
if you want to
Hecht.
buy my book, I don't want to carry so many books.
We have a bunch of books by Duchesne here, if you would like to purchase them. Thank you so much for coming, thank you, security, thank you,